Most people don't realize how much of their life is still being controlled by the shadow. Not because they're weak or unaware, but because the shadow doesn't operate like a loud voice. It hides in patterns. It lives inside your reactions, your emotional habits, and your false sense of identity. Carl Jung made it clear. The shadow is everything you don't want to admit about yourself, everything you've rejected, suppressed, or ignored. And until it becomes conscious, it will run your life. You don't wake up one day and suddenly know that the shadow is gone. It doesn't leave a note or make an announcement. But there are clear signs. And when they start showing up, you know something fundamental has shifted. You've done the work. You've faced what was once too hard to even look at. And now, the shadow no longer calls the shots. Here are 7 ways to know that. 1. You no longer react to everything emotionally. This is one of the clearest signs. When the shadow is still active, your nervous system is constantly hijacked. You feel personally attacked when someone disagrees with you. You take every delay, every look, every silence as rejection. You're defensive even when no one's attacking you. You don't respond, you react. When the shadow loses control, this stops. You start noticing the space between what happens and how you respond. You feel something rising, anger, shame, fear, but you don't act on it immediately. You don't let it decide for you. You've learned to stay with the feeling, examine it, and respond from a place that isn't just habit or pain. You realize that not everything needs a reaction. Not every comment is about you. Not every situation is a test of your worth. You don't get hooked by people's energy. You don't let your old wounds make decisions for you. That doesn't mean you're numb. It means you're in charge. Emotional maturity starts when you stop living like a reaction machine. That shift tells you the shadow isn't the one driving anymore. 2. You don't take everything personally. When the shadow is in control, everything feels like it's about you. Someone cancels plans. It must mean they don't like you. Someone says no. It means you're not good enough. Someone criticizes you. They must be attacking your value. This isn't just oversensitivity. It's projection. The shadow takes your unresolved insecurities and past wounds and pastes them onto the present moment. Once the shadow loosens its grip, your perspective changes. You realize people's behavior often has nothing to do with you. They're tired. They're distracted. They have their own trauma. And their reactions are coming from them, not from some deep truth about your worth. You stop interpreting every event as a reflection of your value. You stop needing external validation to feel secure. And because of that, you don't take offense to everything. You can be told no and stay calm. You can be misunderstood without spiraling. You can receive feedback without collapsing into shame or self-defense. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop personalizing. You see the difference between what belongs to you and what doesn't. And that's something the shadow never allowed. When people are still deeply identified with their wounds, everything becomes a mirror. But when you've done the work, the mirror loses power. You don't need to see yourself everywhere anymore. You've made peace with who you are, and that peace doesn't need to be confirmed in every interaction. This is how you know you've started to take your power back. Your emotional center is inside you, not in everyone else's behavior. There's a shift in responsibility too. When the shadow rules, it's always someone else's fault. You're always the victim. Someone is always doing something to you. But when you're out of that state, you stop looking for enemies. You stop playing out the same tired stories of blame and resentment. You take ownership of your part, not as guilt, but as growth. And that's the key. You're no longer waiting for others to behave perfectly so you can feel okay. You've stopped outsourcing your emotional stability. That means the shadow no longer holds the strings. These first 2 signs are powerful because they show a fundamental change in how you relate to life. You're not operating from fear or ego protection. You're not reacting to your own projections. You're present. You're centered. You're able to deal with reality as it is, not as your wounds imagine it to be. And that's not something you fake. You either feel it or you don't. When you can stay calm in situations that used to ruin your day, that's not weakness. That's transformation. That's evidence that something in you is no longer chaotic. You're not numb, you're clear. You're no longer dragging your old story into every conversation, every relationship, every challenge. You've created space between the past and the present, between emotion and action, between trigger and identity. And that space, that's the beginning of freedom. The shadow doesn't vanish completely. It's always there, part of the psyche, but it's not running the show anymore. You see it, you know it, you made it conscious, and because of that, it can no longer control you. 3, you stop playing roles to get approval. When a shadow still runs your life, you're not living authentically, you're performing. You adapt your behavior to what gets accepted. Around some people, you become agreeable. Around others, you act confident. Around authority, you act obedient. Around friends, you act unbothered. But behind all that, there's a constant fear. If I show who I really am, I won't be accepted. The shadow feeds on this. It keeps you acting, polishing, filtering, hiding. And most of the time, you're not even aware of it. You think that's just your personality. But it's not. It's your survival system, trying to manage rejection before it happens. When the shadow stops running the show, that pattern begins to break. You feel when something you're doing isn't true. You notice when you're slipping into a role. And more importantly, you don't need it anymore. You start showing up without editing yourself. You say what you actually think. You admit what you don't know. You allow silence. You stop putting on emotional makeup every time you speak. That doesn't mean you become rude or careless. It means you become real. You no longer rely on pleasing people to feel safe. You don't need to manage other people's comfort just to avoid discomfort in yourself. You'd rather be honest than impressive. You'd rather be clear than liked. You'd rather be misunderstood for being real than praised for being fake. You know who you are, and that makes all the difference. You also stop needing approval from people who don't even respect themselves. You stop chasing validation from people who aren't emotionally available. You stop trying to win people who don't even know how to connect. That entire game becomes visible. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You realize how much time you've spent trying to be enough for people who didn't even know what they were looking for. And once you stop playing that game, you take your energy back. You start using it to build a life that reflects you, not the version of you that got applause. That's a sign the shadow is no longer pulling the strings, because the shadow is always chasing identity through external reaction. And now you don't need that. You already know who you are. 4, you stop repeating the same emotional cycles. When your shadow is still active, your life is a loop. You attract the same people. You fight the same battles. You keep ending up in the same situations with the same emotions, just different faces. Every relationship starts the same and ends the same. You feel the same betrayals, the same disappointments, the same loss of control. And it always feels like, why is this happening to me again? But the problem isn't the world. It's the unconscious part of you that keeps setting up the same story. You don't realize it, but you've been emotionally programmed to find what's familiar, not what's healthy. And until you make that pattern conscious, it keeps repeating. When the shadow no longer controls you, that pattern breaks. You start choosing differently. You notice red flags earlier, not because you're smarter, but because you're present. You feel discomfort and walk away instead of trying to fix it. You stop trying to earn love through suffering. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. You don't just end bad habits. You stop being attracted to them. You also begin to see your part in the cycle, not from shame, but from awareness. You realize how your silence enabled disrespect, how your need to be needed kept you stuck, how your fear of loneliness kept you tied to people who didn't deserve your loyalty. You're no longer acting like a victim of your own life. You're seeing the pattern for what it is, a shadow loop that needed your participation. Now, you don't participate. You don't reach out when someone ghosts you. You don't explain yourself to people who don't listen. You don't return to situations just because they're familiar. You break the cycle, even if it hurts, even if it's lonely, because that pain is cleaner than the pain of repeating the same wound one more time. This is where your boundaries get stronger. Not because you read a book or memorize lines, but because you feel the difference between your true self and your old shadow pattern. You know how it feels to betray yourself, and you're just done doing that. You stop expecting chaos and calling it normal. You stop calling anxiety chemistry. You stop returning to people who trigger you just because they feel familiar. And when your body starts recognizing peace as peace, not as boredom, you know you've changed. That's a major turning point. When you no longer crave the drama. When you feel peace and stay there. When you don't need emotional highs and lows just to feel alive. Because the shadow thrives on extremes. Love me or leave me. All or nothing. Rescue or abandon. And once the shadow loses its grip, you stop needing those extremes. You can stay with balance. You can stay with calm. You no longer mistake adrenaline for love. You no longer chase confusion and call it passion. You no longer collapse when someone doesn't choose you, because you've already chosen yourself. That's what breaks the cycle. That's what tells you the shadow may still whisper, but it doesn't run your life anymore. 5. You're no longer afraid to be fully seen. One of the clearest signs that the shadow no longer dominates your life is when you stop hiding behind your own image. Most people don't even realize how much of their behavior is built around managing perception. Every word, every action, every silence is calculated, not for truth, but for safety. You're constantly thinking, what would they think if I say this? What if they don't like me? What if I look weak, weird, insecure, too emotional, too intense? This mindset is rooted in fear. It comes from a part of you that learned early on that being fully seen is dangerous. So you build a mask, maybe several. The smart one, the strong one, the calm one, the funny one. And you wore those masks for so long that they became second nature. You even forgot they were masks. But when the shadow loosens its grip, something changes. You stop needing to look perfect. You stop needing to look confident. You stop needing to impress. You stop adjusting your truth based on how other people might receive it. You realize that the version of you that performs, that carefully controls the story, edits the emotion, hides the fear, isn't your real self. It's the self that was built to survive. And you're tired of surviving. You want to live. For real. You begin to show up without explanations. You start to say, I don't know, and mean it. You admit when you're hurt. You talk about your doubts. You stop needing to be above it. You let people see the mess. And you realize something incredible. The world doesn't end when you do. You're still here. You're still breathing. And people who matter don't run away. They lean in. Being seen doesn't feel like exposure anymore. It feels like freedom. You also stop chasing people who only like your mask. You don't adjust your identity to keep a connection. You don't perform resilience just to avoid being judged. You stop faking clarity when you're actually lost, because you no longer believe that worth equals perfection. This is a massive shift, and it's one the shadow hates, because the shadow is all about image. It needs to maintain a false self. It thrives on deception, illusion, hiding. When you take that away, when you let people see the real you, the shadow has nothing left to protect. It's not about oversharing. It's about being honest. It's about not needing to live your entire life behind a wall. And once you've tasted that kind of authenticity, You never go back. 6. You stop fearing your own emotions. The shadow feeds on suppression. It grows strongest when you avoid feeling. That's why so many people don't even know what they feel. They've been disconnected for so long that they only recognize extremes: rage, collapse, panic, numbness. Everything else is buried. When the shadow is in control, emotions feel dangerous. If you cry, you fear breaking. If you're angry, you fear becoming like someone who hurt you. If you feel shame, you avoid it with addiction, distraction, denial. You think, if I go there, I won't come back. So you never do. But when the shadow begins to fade, your relationship with emotion shifts. You don't fear what you feel anymore. You understand that emotions are signals, not threats. You start listening instead of escaping. You allow grief, and it moves through you. You allow anger, and it teaches you boundaries. You allow fear, and it shows you where your wounds are still open. You stop labeling certain emotions as bad. You stop pushing them away. You stop saying, I shouldn't feel this. You sit with the emotion and ask, what is this telling me? And you don't rush to fix it. You don't drown in it either. You just let it be. That's emotional regulation. Not suppression, not detachment, regulation. The ability to feel without losing yourself. And you realize something else. Most of the pain you carried wasn't the emotion itself. It was your resistance to it. The years you spent avoiding grief made it heavier. The years you avoided shame turned it into a prison. But once you face them, once you give them space, they lose power. Not because they vanish, but because they integrate. You also stop projecting your emotions onto others. You don't need to make someone else responsible for what's rising in you. You don't blame your partner for your fear of abandonment. You don't explode at your friend because you haven't set boundaries. You don't guilt trip people just because you feel unworthy. You own what's yours. You feel it fully, and you act from clarity, not chaos. That's when you know something has changed. You don't act from pain anymore. You don't need to turn your emotions into weapons. You don't need to dump them onto someone else. You can hold them because they no longer define you. Carl Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This is exactly what he meant. As long as you're ruled by unprocessed emotion, the shadow runs your decisions. But when you learn to feel, really feel, you stop being a puppet. You start becoming a participant. The emotional part of you is no longer exiled. It's integrated, it's welcomed, and it stops screaming because it's finally being heard. 7. You trust yourself more than your fear. This is the final sign, not because it happens last, but because it changes everything. When the shadow controls your life, fear is in charge, and it wears many faces. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of abandonment, fear of success, fear of being seen, fear of losing control, and worst of all, fear of yourself, your own thoughts, your own emotions, your own impulses. You don't know if you can trust what you feel, so you question yourself constantly. And because of that, you make decisions from fear. You avoid opportunities because you're afraid you're not ready. You hold back from speaking because you're afraid to be misunderstood. You don't try because you're afraid to fail. You stay because you're afraid to be alone. You say yes when you mean no, and no when you mean yes. You live on defense. But when the shadow starts to lose power, a shift happens. You begin to trust your own inner signals more than your fear. You feel nervous, but you still speak. You feel doubt, but you still try. You feel old patterns rising, but you don't act from them. You feel the fear and move anyway. This doesn't mean fear disappears. It means it stops being the final voice. You feel the fear, but you also feel something deeper. A calm, a knowing, a voice that says, this matters more than staying safe. And that voice becomes stronger, clearer, more grounded. That's your real self coming online. You also stop outsourcing your decisions. You don't need 10 opinions before making a move. You don't look to others for emotional permission. You don't need everyone to agree. You know how to check in with yourself. You know when you're acting from fear and when you're acting from truth. And when those two things collide, you choose truth, even when it's uncomfortable. That's real power, not domination, not control, but inner alignment. Your actions match your values. Your boundaries reflect your worth. Your silence is intentional, not forced by shame. You're no longer operating from anxiety. You're operating from clarity. And that clarity doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be consistent. You also start to see fear differently. You don't treat it like the enemy. You see it as part of you, a signal, a warning, a reflection of something deeper. But you don't let it steer your life anymore. Because you've realized something the shadow didn't want you to see. Fear lies. It tells you you're not ready when you are. It tells you you're not worthy when you've always been. It tells you you'll fail, but it's really afraid of what happens if you succeed. When you start trusting yourself more than your fear, the shadow panics because it knows it's losing control. It knows the spell is breaking. It knows it can't manipulate you through doubt anymore. You've grown past the old survival strategies, and now you're leading from something deeper. This is what Jung meant when he talked about integration. The shadow doesn't disappear, but it stops running things behind the scenes. You see it, you know it, you recognize its voice, and most importantly, you don't obey it anymore. You don't get tricked by its urgency. You don't believe its catastrophes. You don't build your identity around its limits. You stepped outside the pattern, and now you have choice. And here's the most important part. You didn't get here through theory. You got here by facing yourself. Not once, but again and again. Every time you felt discomfort and didn't run. Every time you spoke truth instead of hiding. Every time you said no and held it. Every time you stopped performing and started showing up. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. And slowly, the shadow lost its grip. Not because it disappeared, but because you stopped feeding it. This is what freedom actually feels like. Not perfection, not confidence in every situation, not being fearless, but this acting in alignment even when fear is present. That's maturity. That's integration. That's strength. And now, looking back, you start to see just how much of your life used to be controlled by fear disguised as logic. You weren't being cautious, you were hiding. You weren't being patient, you were paralyzed. You weren't being smart, you were playing small. And now, you're done with that. You're not interested in who you had to be anymore. You're interested in who you actually are. That's the final turning point. Not a loud victory, not a radical reinvention. Just this, the quiet certainty that you don't need to fear yourself anymore. That even when doubt shows up, you trust your deeper voice more. You're no longer trapped in reaction. You're no longer controlled by masks. You're no longer chasing peace outside yourself. You've brought it home. And now, the shadow knows it's not in charge. When the shadow no longer runs your life, the outside world doesn't magically become easier. People don't suddenly treat you better. Circumstances don't always improve. But something fundamental shifts. Your relationship to everything changes. You're not controlled by the same internal chaos. You stop looking at life through the lens of your old pain. You stop moving through the world trying to defend, impress, or escape. You start simply being, not as a performance, but as a truth you finally accepted. You realize how much of your past life was shaped by fear of being misunderstood. How much energy you gave to managing other people's opinions. How often you said yes just to avoid discomfort. How many parts of yourself you buried just to feel safe. And now, that pressure is gone. You don't need to explain yourself to everyone. You don't need to fix how people see you. You're okay with not being liked. You're okay with walking away. You're okay with being seen for who you really are, even if it doesn't get you applause. You no longer feel the need to shrink when someone else feels insecure. You no longer silence your truth to protect fragile egos. You don't bend to fit environments that were never built for authenticity, because you've stopped needing external conditions to give you permission to exist. This internal shift affects every part of your life. Relationships become cleaner. You stop trying to earn love. You stop chasing connection that requires self-betrayal. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. You stop calling someone deep just because they mirror your old trauma. You stop thinking that suffering equals depth. You finally understand. Love that requires you to abandon yourself isn't love. It's emotional dependency with good PR. So you stop. You stop fighting for people who make you feel invisible. You stop proving yourself to people who don't even know who they are. You stop performing in hopes that someone will finally choose you. Because you've already chosen yourself, not in theory, but in practice. Your standards change, not in arrogance, but in clarity. You're no longer available for relationships that feel like emotional negotiation. You're no longer interested in people who need you to be smaller so they can feel bigger. You don't need chaos to feel connection. You don't need confusion to feel alive. This clarity also brings a strange kind of peace. Not the fake peace of silence and suppression, but the real kind, where you can sit alone and not feel like something's missing. You're no longer haunted by a feeling that you're behind, or broken, or late. You stop measuring yourself against people who are still lost in performance. You stop comparing your healing to someone else's coping mechanism. You understand now. Progress doesn't always look impressive. Sometimes it looks like doing nothing instead of overreacting, saying no and not explaining, walking away and not checking your phone, sitting with discomfort instead of numbing it, not needing to win the argument, not needing to prove your point, just being with what's real and letting that be enough. You also become less attached to outcomes. You don't obsess over whether it works out, whether they stay, whether you're understood. You care, but you're not owned by it. You let go easier. You forgive quicker, not because you're passive, but because you don't want to carry what isn't yours. You've carried enough. You've carried childhood wounds, other people's expectations, guilt that wasn't yours, responsibilities you were never meant to hold. And now you're done, not out of resentment, but out of awareness. That awareness becomes your filter. You feel when something doesn't belong. You trust it. You don't argue with your own knowing anymore. This internal alignment changes your energy. People feel it. Some are drawn to it. Others are intimidated by it. But you don't adjust either way. Because now you're not chasing belonging. You're embodying it. The same goes for purpose. You stop chasing meaning in status, in success, in constant productivity. You're not trying to prove your worth through what you achieve. You're not attaching your identity to your output. You start doing things because they're aligned, not because they'll make you look valuable. You stop needing to be seen as someone important. You just want to be someone real. This doesn't mean life becomes easy. You still experience grief. You still lose people. You still get hurt. But the difference is you don't collapse. You don't spiral. You don't become someone else to survive it. You meet it from wholeness. You hold it without breaking apart. Because now, the shadow isn't trying to hijack your emotions and turn them into identity. You know the difference between feeling sadness and becoming it, between facing fear and obeying it, between recognizing anger and letting it own you. That separation, that self-awareness, is what gives you power. Carl Jung didn't say that you destroy the shadow. He said you make it conscious. You integrate it. You give it a seat at the table without letting it run the meeting. And once you've done that, your entire way of moving through the world changes. You're no longer ruled by shame. You don't react from trauma. You don't abandon yourself when things get hard. You don't lose your voice just because the room gets tense. You stay with yourself. That's the mark of someone who's not governed by their unconscious. It's not about perfection. It's about presence. You could be in the same situations as before, the same stress, the same conflict, the same uncertainty, and you're simply not the same person inside them. You're not leaking. You're not performing. You're not pretending. You're not waiting for permission. You're just present. And that presence changes everything. You can feel it in how you breathe, in how you sleep, in how you walk into a room without needing to manage everyone else's emotions, in how you speak without rehearsing, in how you sit with silence. And it doesn't feel like failure anymore. This is what happens when a shadow no longer runs your life. Not a perfect life, but a real one. When a shadow no longer runs your life, what you feel most is not power, it's relief. Not the relief of escape, but the quiet understanding that you're finally no longer at war with yourself. There's no grand celebration, no final battle, no bright finish line, just a calm inside you that was never available before. You've stopped negotiating with parts of yourself you don't trust. You've stopped defending against truths you already know. You stopped trying to prove you're not broken because you no longer believe you are. That's the deepest shift. You're no longer trying to fix something that isn't wrong with you. You now understand that most of what you thought was wrong, your doubt, your sadness, your fear, your hesitation, wasn't dysfunction. It was your system protecting you. The shadow wasn't evil. It was just trying to keep you safe. It developed in response to pain, to survival, to fear. But now, you don't need it to drive anymore. You thank it. You take the keys back, and you lead. You live differently now. You make decisions slower, but cleaner. You pause before speaking, not out of fear, but out of presence. You don't rush into connection, but when you choose it, it's solid. You don't chase highs, you build consistency. You don't seek intensity, you trust stability. You stop craving to be seen because you already see yourself. This doesn't mean your shadow never speaks. It does. But now you recognize the voice. You hear the old messages. Don't say that, they'll leave you, you're not enough. And instead of obeying, you respond with clarity. You say, I know where that came from. I know who that voice used to protect, but I'm not there anymore. And the voice loses power. That's what it means to integrate. You don't delete the past. You stop letting it run the present. You don't erase the wound. You stop identifying with it. You know what happened. You felt it. You've processed it. And now you don't need to repeat it through every relationship, every conflict, every choice. You also stop needing to re-explain yourself to people who still see the old you. You understand that not everyone will evolve with you. Not everyone will understand your silence. Not everyone will honor your boundaries. And that's fine, because your self-worth isn't on trial anymore. You no longer shape-shift to avoid rejection. You don't chase those who misunderstand your peace as distance. You don't stay small to make someone else comfortable. You're no longer trying to be understood. You're just being. And in that being, you begin to trust something deeper. Not just yourself, but life. You stop fighting every unknown. You stop analyzing every silence. You stop panicking when plans change. You understand that not everything needs control. Not everything is a threat. Not everything is a test of who you are. You move through life with less fear and more attention. You notice things, how your body feels when something's wrong, how your energy shifts when you betray yourself, how peaceful it feels when you do what's right, even when it's hard. You don't need permission to rest. You don't need to earn your joy. You don't need to prove that you've healed. Your life proves it for you. And yes, sometimes the old reactions still show up. You get triggered. You fall into silence. You second guess. But now you recover fast. You recognize what's happening. You don't spiral. You don't collapse. You return to center. That's the difference. Your recovery time is your proof. Your presence in chaos is your evidence. Your ability to hold discomfort without losing yourself, that's how you know. You're not pretending anymore. You're not acting from default. You're not running a script someone handed you years ago. You're choosing, each day, each moment, who you are and how you live. And it's quieter than you expected. There's less drama, less conflict, less crisis. Not because life is easier, but because your inner world is no longer feeding chaos into every corner. You stop projecting. You stop blaming. You've stopped rescuing. You've stopped managing. You've stopped running. You've simply stopped. And from that stillness, something else has emerged. You, the version of you that isn't fractured, that doesn't need to dominate or disappear or explain. The version that can simply stand in clarity, in contradiction, in change, and not fall apart. Carl Jung said that wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration. You've done that, or you're doing it now. You've stopped trying to be the light and started becoming whole, shadow and all. You no longer fear your darkness. You've looked into it. You've sat with it. You felt what it holds. And you didn't run. That's what gave you your life back. Because the life you were living before, that wasn't really yours. That was a shadow version, built on wounds, maintained through fear, shaped by avoidance. But now, this one, the one you're in, is different. You say what you mean. You feel what you feel. You know what's yours and what's not. You move with presence. You stay with pain. You don't turn away from truth just because it's heavy. And when someone asks what changed, you don't have to explain. You just say, I stopped letting my shadow speak for me. That's enough.